Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. It's about community, why community engagement and process matter in the collective impact. Thank you for joining us today. This is the third webinar on a three-part series diving deeper into the content of articles that were featured in Collective Insights on Collective Impact supplement that was featured in the fall 2014 Stanford Social Innovation Review. My name is Sherry Brady, and I am the Senior Associate for Strategic Partnerships with the Aspen Institute Forum for Community Solutions, and we are one of the partners in the Collective Impact Forum along with FSG. The Collective Impact Forum exists to accelerate the rigor and practice of collective impact in order to create positive social change around the world. It is the place to find the tools and training that can help achieve success, as well as an expanding network of like-minded individuals coming together from across the sectors to share useful experience and knowledge. Next slide. We have a terrific program for you today with a tremendous group of speakers that are listed on the slide in front of you. But before we get started, I wanted to just touch on a few housekeeping items to let you know some things. Today's program is 90 minutes long, and you are encouraged to submit written questions and comments at any point during the presentation. To do so, you'll see at the bottom of your screen a general chat tab. You can click on that tab, type your question in the box at the bottom of the space, and then click send. Your questions are only visible to the presenters and the moderators, and the presenters will verbally respond to as many questions as time allows during the Q&A period at the end of the presentations. At the conclusion of today's presentation, you'll be redirected to an online evaluation form. Please take a moment to complete the evaluation. We value your feedback, and it helps us as we do future programming. If you have any technical problems and need assistance during the webinar, please call KRM. The support number is 1-800-775-7654. Again, that's 1-800-775-7654. Today's slides will be available following the presentation at the collectiveimpactforum.org. So we're going to kick off in a minute with our first speaker, but I just wanted to do a little bit of framing for you. Next slide. Communities are a critical factor to the success of collective impact efforts. By community, we mean the individuals, families, networks, and organizations who are impacted by the initiative and who will participate in it, but are not usually considered to have an active leadership role. This is especially those who are directly affected by the problems that are trying to be solved by the initiative. Including the community narrative in crafting solutions increases the credibility and the effectiveness of solutions developed by the efforts. Here are some reasons why collaborators should engage communities. It helps with understanding pressing systemic community challenges, sort of having a process that really helps understand the issue from both sides of the aisle, not just from the experts, and I'm using finger quotes when I say that. It clarifies issues that arise around the challenge. It helps with co-creating solutions. It sparks innovative problem-solving rooted in lived experiences of the community. It ensures that the community narrative is a part of the solutions created. It identifies and spreads unique solutions that exist within the community and gets those ideas on the table. It helps to verify the direction of the collaborative efforts, gets feedbacks on specific strategies and indicators from communities, particularly those who will be the beneficiaries. It also helps to expand the reach of strategies, to the reach of innovative strategies that are thought of that you might have thought of if you were thinking of it sort of just with the experts, but people who are sort of seeking what they need and know. It can evoke and sustain the will to take aligned action amongst the whole community. It also builds community capacity to lead and sustain change. It trains stakeholders in skills of effective collaboration and advocacy and strategy execution, and it helps to share resources and learning across the community. Next slide. There are different levels of approaches of stakeholder engagement. Collaborators need to think about what their community engagement goals are at each phase of their work. This will help you decide what approach is best at that phase. As the collaborative grows, the levels of engagement should also grow. The chart on the screen now is adapted from the work of co-catalysts in the Collective Impact Forum, the Tamarack Institute, and it highlights the levels of engagement. From inform to consult, involve, collaborate, and co-lead. And really, depending on, as it says, the object of the approach. If you just want to inform, it's really just providing information to the public. Consulting is gather feedback from stakeholders, for example, a forum. involved is to work directly with them continuously to ensure that they're constantly understanding and being considered. Collaborate is to partner with them on each aspect of the decision-making. To co-lead is to really place a good bit of the decision-making process in the hands of the community and the stakeholders as they drive decisions and implementation of the work. Next slide. And here are just some examples, which I just went over a little bit, of the activities at each of the levels. The panel of presenters, that's just to give you sort of an idea of how when we talk about community engagement, what we mean and what we're thinking about. The panel of the presenters will talk about what they have learned in their efforts to engage communities in collective impact work. We're going to start with Stacy Stewart, who is the U.S. President for United Way Worldwide. Welcome, Stacy.
Thanks, Sherry, and certainly it's a pleasure to be here with all of you all and share with you all a little bit of how at United Way we think about this work, which we believe is so critical to the work we do to try to transform communities and work within communities to help lead to collective change. So thanks for allowing me to be a part. I'm going to spend just a few minutes sharing with you all some of our perspective on community engagement. But let me just start with level setting. I think most folks on this webinar probably know United Way. But I think, and if we could go to the next slide, that'd be great. But I think it would be helpful just to ground us in our mission and how we think of our value on the next slide under foundations of our work. So our mission at United Way is to improve lives by mobilizing the caring power of communities around the world to advance the common good. We really think of ourselves as being that organization that can really mobilize from across the community to help communities align around common outcomes and achieve common results. And that speaks to the value proposition of how we galvanize and connect a diverse set of individuals and institutions across sectors to mobilize resources, to align around strategies, to engage folks at every level of the community to create systemic and long-term change. This value proposition is really interesting to me because it's actually been the most enduring value proposition of United Way, despite what everyone thinks about United Way as a big community fundraiser or focused on resources. At the end of the day, what United Way has been for 128 years is really that entity that pulls all folks of a community together to work on things together. That's why our name is United Way, I guess, and that's why we say we live united. Let's go to the next slide. Just want to talk a little bit about how we work to empower and mobilize communities. And I think what I'll do in this session is really give some examples of how we're delivering on this mission in the context of some multi-sector partnerships that are aimed at critical community issues. The first thing that we think of ourselves as doing is connecting people with the tools they need to create impact on priority community issues, engaging stakeholders, getting in their hands the expertise and the resources needed to address critical social problems. The second area we focus on is ensuring that these multi-sector partnerships can take real action on what's important to residents, helping institutions hear what the community aspires to and understand the on-the-ground realities that are really faced by families and what barriers are standing in the way of effective action. The third is around using the community's priorities, everything we hear in terms of what's important to the community, to guide our work and to guide the work of our partners. Building trust with the community is probably the most critical element of what helps to create sustainable change. It's a key driver for helping people and communities realize their goals. The next is around mobilizing the workplace. I mean, this is where United Way is incredibly strong. We have incredible relationships with large corporate partners, small and medium-sized partners. A lot of our engagement in community actually happens with the people who live in that community but work with key employers in a community. And so this workplace, which is tended to be a vehicle for mobilizing resources, ends up being an incredible place for us to mobilize and hear the voices of people who live and work in those communities. And so mobilizing employees in the workplace who are also citizens and community residents themselves helps us to realize their potential as change agents as well. And then lastly, providing opportunities for strategic volunteerism and advocacy. This is really around how we help link people to effective system change strategies. So if we go to the next slide, I just want to give some examples of the first area of how we connect people to tools and expertise. One example I just wanted to point out is one from the Woodlands, Texas, which is a community just north of Houston. There's an organization called the Healthy Living Alliance, which is led by the United Way, and the Healthy Living Alliance has this goal of increasing the number of residents in Montgomery County, Texas, who are living at a healthy weight, and increasing the number of those residents by 10% by 2020. The partnership recognized that one of the key barriers standing in the way of achieving this outcome was the lack of supports for doctors to help them talk with parents about children who were obese. So the local hospital and the United Way provided them access to a recognized pediatric obesity expert and gave them tools to help physicians broach this pretty sensitive subject with parents. The United Way, they also initiated the Healthy Me initiative in 8 underperforming schools that had high numbers of kids from low-wage families. The United Way involved schools in 3 districts integrating the health curriculum across campuses, not just as part of the physical education class. Helping teachers incorporate healthy eating, healthy choices, and physical activity into the daily curriculum really helped to reinforce the messages and really the rationale for changes in the behavior that everyone was seeking. And we think the engagement of the pediatricians and the teachers and the tools that are provided to them are really beginning to have a positive impact on childhood obesity in Montgomery County. So we're going to continue to track progress there. Next is this area of ensuring partnerships take action on what's important, and this is also from Houston as well. We've got in our United Way in Houston one of the most active United Ways involved in community engagement and a real model in our network. In Houston, they began having community conversations, and all of those conversations are guiding the work that they're pursuing in their financial stability initiative, which is called Thrive. And as part of an effort to support early grade reading, listening sessions were conducted with parents in English, Spanish, and Chinese in several targeted neighborhoods around low-performing schools. The parents said that they were unsure about how to navigate the school bureaucracy. They were needing more information on how to best support their children academically. So what the United Way did was they brought together the schools and several nonprofits to address these concerns and then to engage parents more authentically. The information about the on-the-ground realities of these parents really changed how the institutional partners, the school districts and other partners, worked together towards the common goal of increasing third-grade reading proficiency. Next, another example is in Spokane, Washington. The United Way engaged local citizens in community conversations as well, and that informed the organizational priorities. It influenced the community's Accelerate Success Cradle to Career community report card. As part of the release of the report card, our partner, Rich Harwood, who's been a tremendous partner with us on all of our work in community engagement, came out to Spokane and spoke about the importance of authentic engagement to multiple community stakeholder groups, including the United Way Board of Directors, the leadership team for Accelerate Success, the Chamber of Commerce, and over 150 individuals gathered to participate in the launch of the initiative. And this stakeholder and community engagement is viewed in Spokane as not a one-time effort. It really is an ongoing effort, which I think is something that will probably come out in many of these conversations today, an ongoing process to ensure collective impact can be sustained over the long haul, and that the organization that's serving as the backbone can really be the steward for the community's aspirations. And the last example here is the United Way in San Diego. They're working in San Diego, and they're very committed to building public knowledge through ongoing engagement with all segments of the community. In 2011, there was data that came from the community conversations. It was published. It was disseminated widely in a report called Voices for the Common Good. San Diego Speaks Out on Education. And the themes from these conversations really indicated that many parents felt shut out by the public schools. They experienced language and cultural barriers in their schools and communities, and they believed the schools could not be successful without the entire community being involved in education issues. And these conversations were important because they began to be factored into ongoing design and development of the Cradle to Career effort in San Diego called the Partnership for Children, that's gotten started in a vulnerable San Diego neighborhood. And this is ultimately leading to the development of peer engagement parents engaging other parents across the community to ensure ongoing communication and information among parents. If we go to the next example, I just want to point out for you something that's happening outside the U.S. We can stay on this slide. But an example of what's going on outside the U.S., especially in even a partnership between our United Way and our United Way in Panama. Our United Way in Houston actually trained United Ways in Panama, our United Way in Panama, on our efforts around community engagement. And our United Way in Panama embarked on an initiative called Education from the Voices of Youth. They engaged more than 800 young people in urban, rural, and indigenous areas of Panama who've now been able to weigh in on what they seek in education. And as a result of this kind of engagement, the program has really heard from students saying that they absolutely care about an up-to-date curriculum. They are really demanding high-caliber teachers. These are all voices of young people. And they want an opportunity to express themselves. Our United Way of Panama published this report, this Education from the Voices of Youth, and distributed 300 reports of the study and 300 brochures of the study. They invited 400 people from media, from the public sectors, nonprofit sectors, and private sectors to the launch, including the Panama's Minister of Education and presidents of other civil society organizations. They've eventually reached an audience of more than 6,400 people through social media challenges, and our United Way has worked across sectors with all kinds of organizations at a leadership level and across the country, and to use these findings to serve as the backbone for projects in education. Going back to the point I raised around mobilizing the workplace, again, I'll pull an example from San Diego. The United Way, they are offering employees in the workplace campaign. So as you know, United Way does workplace campaigns every year. Instead of just reporting out to those employees what the United Way was doing and what the results were from year over year, what they decided to do was to go to employees and offer an opportunity for those employees to talk about their own aspirations for the community. So we basically took those same community conversation tools we use across the community and brought them into the workplace. United Way staff in San Diego recorded the information that they heard from these employees. They acknowledged the people's aspirations were really clear. They guided the conversations to not only opportunities to share those aspirations, but how people could direct those passions into ways to give, to advocate, and to volunteer in education, income, and health in their communities. And really, this became a new way of doing business for the United Way in San Diego, and a new way of doing business across the board. So I know time is up. Let me just quickly say if we just touch on the slide, connecting leaders to community, the next slide. For us, ultimately, the challenge is to connect institutional leaders to community realities, to empower partnerships, to deliver on communities' shared aspirations. We really believe that to be most effective and to sustain collective impact efforts, it's critical for partnerships to engage community at large, and especially those most affected by community issues. For us, authentic engagement is important if we're going to reach our vision, which is really a world where all individuals and families achieve their human potential through education, income stability, and healthy lives. So thank you, and I look forward to answering more questions and listening to the speakers as well.
Stacey, great. Thank you. I have a quick question, just taking a bit of a moderator perspective. What do you guys use for metrics when you're measuring your community engagement efforts? Is it your increase in people involved in campaigns? How do you measure your success in engaging your communities and mobilizing the communities?
Well, you're asking a good question, and I'm not sure we've got the most refined metrics, but I think it starts at the basic level, sort of like defining outputs and outcomes. I mean, I think, first of all, we want to know that we're reaching a certain number of people to determine if we've got a critical mass of engagement and are hearing certain themes that seem to be consistent around the community. For us, it's not necessarily just about numbers of people engaged. It is about the quality of engagement. So there is a point at which, and we've kind of learned this through Rich, that once we begin to have community conversations and are listening, once we begin to be able to theme what we're hearing, we don't necessarily need to go to thousands more people just to hear the same thing over again. In fact, what we find is that once we start to hear themes, we can trust those themes as being fairly consistent around a community and enough to inform strategies, enough to inform partnerships, and how we should sort of authentically build trust and work with partners across the community. From there, the level of engagement in the community for us should translate into meaningful ways that people take charge of making change in their communities. So for us at United Way, that does come in the form down the road of, are people actually giving to these things that they say they care about? Are we actually creating opportunities for people to give, to advocate, and to volunteer? And are we seeing an uptick in how people fundamentally want to be engaged? But one of the things that we know about that is that if we're not offering up those opportunities, if we're not working on the issues that people care about, we probably won't see that translate into meaningful opportunities for people to take action. So at the end of the day, that becomes a great proxy for us.
Great. Thanks so much, Stacey.
Sure.
I just want to remind people, if the conversation sparks a question, please write it down immediately so that we can make sure that we have it as we're moving through this. Next, we have Rich Harwood, who's president and founder of the Harwood Institute for Public Innovation. Thanks for joining us, Rich.
Hey, Sherry. Thanks so much for having me. It's great to join everyone. For those of you who don't know, the Institute is interested in how we collectively address pressing problems in communities and how we change the way communities actually work together. In order to do that, we develop what we call public innovators and boundary-spanning organizations and networks that learn a practice around what we call turning outward. We can go to the next slide, Rachel. But today what I want to focus on is just a piece of our work that I hope is helpful to everyone who's trying to think about collective impact and how we accelerate and deepen the good efforts that we're trying in our communities and create the kind of impact that will give people a genuine sense of hope about their lives and about the future of their communities. Some time ago, about 15, 20 years ago, we were sitting in our Institute's office. We were working in 12 or 15 or so communities at the same time, and we kept asking ourselves questions about why was it that some communities were moving forward and others weren't? Why was it that one initiative worked in one community, but when it was tried in another community that almost looked exactly the same, it worked in one community and didn't work in another? Why was it that some communities were able to move forward really fast, relatively speaking, and others seemed to be stuck and couldn't get moving at all? Or if they did get moving, why was it that they made progress and all of a sudden, notwithstanding that progress, they slid back to where they were before? And so next slide, Rachel. And so what we discovered in doing that work and then doing a lot of research funded by a number of foundations in the U.S. was that communities go through stages, and every community is in a stage. And what we found out through all of this work over about 10 years' time is that there are really 5 stages of community life. And as I said, every community is in one of these stages. The challenge, I think, for a lot of us who do this work is our strategies are calibrated really to the growth stage, this 4th stage that you see second from the right. While most communities in America, at least in the U.S., the vast, vast majority of communities that I've seen and that we work with are in one of the first 3 stages, which has a lot of implications. And what we've found in our work on the ground and practical work in communities across the U.S. is you can accelerate your movement through these stages, but you can't skip a stage. And so what becomes really important, I think, if we want to deliver on the promise of collective impact, if we really want to set the expectations that communities can believe in and can rally around and where we can create the public will that is necessary for change, is we need to figure out, if we want to move forward, where we're starting from and what it will take to move through these stages. And one quick thing before we go to the next slide, because I'll take you through a couple of these stages so you can get a feel for them, is the ability to move through these stages is determined by a set of community conditions. There are things like, do you have different layers of leaders in your community and how robust are those layers? Do we have community norms, productive community norms in communities for engaging with one another and getting work done? Do we have boundary-spanning catalytic organizations that know how to bring people together across dividing lines and move things forward? Do we have productive community conversations where we can identify those things that really matter to us, that matter to a community, and so that we can move forward collectively? And these community conditions, this civic culture in a sense, is what enables us to move through. And if you can think about it this way, these conditions create the enabling environment in which all of our work on collective impact takes place. And so if we want to be successful in collective impact, and importantly, if we want to sustain and drive forward the gains that we're making, we need to make sure that we're paying attention to these community conditions. So let's go to the next slide. And I just want to talk about, so these are the 5 stages: waiting place, impasse, catalytic, growth, sustain and renew. And you can get more information on this off our website. I just want to pick 2 stages, because I only have a few minutes here. I want to pick 2 stages that we find a lot of communities in, which may resonate with your community, and talk about what it feels like and what the implications are for moving forward in the time that I have left. So I want to talk about the impasse stage. And this is a stage where communities feel like they're at loggerhead. There's a lot of emotion in the community that things aren't working. And if you go to a community at impasse, you'll often hear people say, enough is enough. We can't go on like this anymore. Here's the thing. In impasse stage, there oftentimes is agreement about what's wrong, but not agreement about what we need to do about it. It's often very hard to get agreement about moving forward. And so there's more clarity about what's wrong than where we're going. And in the impasse stage, what we find is typically people don't trust their leaders. Their public conversations, their community conversations, their civic conversations are typically acrimonious and divisive, and a lot of finger pointing. There aren't necessarily a lot of organizations in the community that people trust. People often say, they seem more interested in in getting credit in their own turf than they are in helping us identify and move forward on the things that matter to us. And so the question there is, what do we do about that? I'll come back to that in a moment. The second stage I want to talk about is catalytic, the one that follows impasse. And here, the difference here is that what we're starting to see is our pockets of change starting to emerge. And what's important to know is moving out of the impasse stage into catalytic, what we see are not comprehensive solutions usually, but these pockets of change that are starting to emerge. They typically are moving in different directions because this is the stage, particularly early on, where people are innovating and trying things and seeing what works, what has resonance with people and meaning to people. But here's what's important to know about the catalytic stage as you're moving forward in these pockets. While you're moving forward and the things you're working on, you might think, or we might think, or the folks who are working on them might think, that everything is moving forward and everything's great, except particularly in the first half of the catalytic stage, 90% of the community isn't touched by these new pockets of change. And so for the 90% or 80% or 70% of the community that isn't touched, for them, they're still living in a stage that feels a lot like impasse. And so that has a lot of implications for how we think about moving forward. So let's go to the next slide. There we go. And let me just talk about a couple of things that are important to think about when you're in these 2 stages. So when you're in impasse, as I mentioned before, the number one danger and the number one trap for communities moving forward is we misread people's agreement on what's wrong for agreement about what it is to move forward. And so here, comprehensive plans, comprehensive visions might be important, but what becomes really important is, can we identify those things that people really care about? Can we reflect them back to the community? And can we figure out where it is that we can start to get movement on things that matter to people? And here what's really important is the things that you might be able to get movement on may not be the most important things to people or to your strategy, but they're important in terms of demonstrating progress, and it's important to pick things that people care about, even if it might be not the most systemic or intractable problem that you're facing. The danger here is that by picking off too much to work on, that our efforts will be undermined by a lack of trust that Stacy was talking about, a lack of leaders that we trust, a lack of organizations that are working for the common good. And so what becomes really pivotal in your collective impact efforts at this stage is not only what is your agenda and where can you start to move, but how is it that you actually develop these community conditions and capacities so that the community can move forward and work together in a different way. On catalytic, it's very much the same, but here what happens is, as I mentioned before, is you start to have pockets of change that are starting to emerge while the rest of the community is still more or less at the impasse stage. And our impulse as professionals is to coordinate all these efforts and get them in lockstep so that we can create collective efforts. That's a danger, because particularly early on in the catalytic stage, what we're looking for is innovation and creativity and to see what works, to see what takes hold, to see what really truly has resonance with people, and that requires trial and error. So here what becomes important is how is it that we develop these pockets? How do we begin to develop networks where people can start to share what they're learning about the community and what it means for us moving forward? And then lastly, what I want to mention here is in the catalytic stage, there's an emerging competition between narratives. And I know some of my colleagues are going to talk about this in a couple of minutes. But here's the thing. There's a new emerging narrative of possibility that's coming from these pockets. But at the same time, the dominant narrative that change can't happen here, that we don't have the capabilities to get together, that we won't build things together, also still is in existence. And so what becomes important here is how is it that we engage the competition of narratives, not by hype and sensationalizing our efforts and our impact, but by actually highlighting what's happening in an authentic way, in a genuine way, both the successes and the failures, so that people can start to see them and knit them together in a new narrative that starts to compete with the dominant narrative that we can't make things happen. So let me just end here. I know this is a lot of material to cover in just a couple of minutes. The reason why these stages are so important to collective impact is because they can help us figure out where is it that we're starting and how is it that we can calibrate our efforts moving forward. What are the issues that we can begin to peel off and work on where we can gain traction? Because the whole effort moving through these stages is to create a sense of trajectory and a sense of momentum behind that trajectory, a sense that we're moving in a new direction, we're building something new. And how is it that we can begin to forge a new, more can-do narrative that gives people a genuine sense of possibility and hope? I now believe I am officially out of time, so let me stop here.
Thanks, Rich. I just had a quick follow-up. Excuse me. So my question, I guess I'm trying to figure out is, there are going to be elements of community, obviously, that move faster in acceptance than others. So is it a mistake to sort of try to bring everybody along at the same time? Is it just, how do you continue to keep the momentum forward? Is there sort of a tipping point where you've got enough that you can sort of move to the next, or is it...
Yeah, I think one way to think about this is, so if you're an impasse or catalytic, you can have a vision of where you want to go, but you need to be prepared to continually recalibrate that as you learn, as you move ahead and learn. And what I would say to those communities that are in those earlier stages, which is most a lot of times, is what you want to figure out is how can you get moving? How can you get moving on things you can win at? When you're winning, how can you start to tell a new story about what you're winning at and put that story in juxtaposition to the dominant story that change can't happen? And to your point about maintaining momentum, what we find in communities is what maintains momentum is a sense of possibility rooted in a belief that we're on a better trajectory that we can actually win at. And so that becomes the critical set of choices that I think in collective impact efforts in particular we need to be able to make.
Great. Thanks. Next we have Albert Maldonado, who is a program manager at the California Endowment. Thank you for joining us today, Albert.
Thanks, Sherry. Thanks so much for having me and allowing the California Endowment to share a little about our Building Healthy Communities work. So welcome, everyone. And I just want to quickly say that, I'm going to really talk about our Building Healthy Communities work, in particular our community engagement efforts that went into the planning stage, into the planning process, and how they've really, fed our Building Healthy Communities initiative. So, really kind of taking, kind of a collective impact frame in mind. So let me go ahead and jump right on in. So next slide, please. First things first, Building Healthy Communities, it is part of our 10-year statewide place-based initiative that really spans 14 communities across the state. We began a planning process in 2009, which was really a kind of comprehensive, comprehensive concurrent planning process that spanned 14 communities over, a 12 to 18-month planning process. And so, really to kind of start things off, we essentially gave, communities 4 big results and 10 outcomes essentially, asking communities to come up with a 10-year roadmap, if you will, for what their 2020 vision would be. And so part of that process is really, we engaged community-based organizations, system leaders, young people, community advocates, and others. And so it really was about, investing in the voice and perspective of folks who, have traditionally been left out of decision-making tables. So towards that end, we engage communities, from the far north all the way up the California border, so down north and tribal adjacent lands, down into, of course, the Bay Area and into Southern California, of course, covering the central part of the state as well. And so during that process, we essentially, kind of developed relationships with new folks in our communities like Coachella, like Merced, kind of building on Richard's conversation earlier. We intentionally chose communities that had both higher levels of capacity and engagement and readiness around kind of advancing a systems and policy change frame, while also working with communities like Merced, like Coachella and others, where there was very limited capacity. Part of that as well was to really invest in structure, invest in local structure. So, we have hub staff in each of our 14 places. We have evaluation and learning staff, so I'll talk about that in a moment as well. And ultimately, the desire was to let communities prioritize what issues and areas that they wanted to focus on over the next several years. And so next slide, please. As part of that work as well, we've embedded TCE, or we designated TCE program managers. So we have designated staff in each of our 14 places. We think that that's a good way of also connecting with the local hub structures, but it's a way for TCE to continue to remain, aware and cognizant and responsive to, ongoing and emerging community needs, while also, also supporting the local folks to step up and assume leadership. So after the planning process, what we did essentially was took the priorities and aggregated those into three primary buckets of work. So, what we heard from communities was, schools matter, right? Ensuring that the school climate, school discipline policies, the social and emotional services and supports that happen at schools absolutely have implications on health. And so there's a set of priorities and strategies there, and I'll say a word or two about those in a moment. On the neighborhood side, so we also heard pretty loud and clear that land use absolutely had implications on health decisions, on health and decisions that are made, ensuring the food system and the environmental health, air quality, all of those things had implications in our 14 places. And again, it was about bringing residents, youth, others, non-traditional folks to the table to actually figure out, what needs to be done and how it needs to be done and who needs to drive those changes, and also looking at, opportunities for support in communities. And then looking at our prevention bucket of work, as a health foundation, ensuring access to health care coverage, community prevention, and those kinds of things remains an issue. But what we heard pretty loud and clear as well was that these systems also have to meet the communities where they are and have to really support the needs of residents. And so a couple of quick examples, and I'm running through a lot of this, just being mindful of time. School discipline was one of those issues that bubbled up. And it was an area, when we think of health and as a health foundation, we were scratching our head a little bit around how are we going to address school discipline and how is that a health issue. But what we heard pretty loud and clear from our young people across the state was, one, young people are just disappearing, and two, these young people are ending up in the juvenile justice system. Once we started to kind of, figure out, well, what happens to young people once they get into the juvenile justice system, we started to really see the health implications there. And so we needed to move a more upstream strategy, and that's really how we, rallied the foundation's resources, research partners, so on and so forth, really to kind of keep kids in school. And so that's really, an area and an example that I was hoping to lift up around around, TCE being responsive to community needs that we weren't necessarily being mindful of. So a couple of things that I certainly want to cover around our theory of change and how community engagement fits in. So I've talked about the kind of what in terms of the content areas, but we think the how is really critical. And so we think that there are certain core ingredients that absolutely go into community change. And so, those four drivers of change really are leveraging partnerships, collaborative efficacy, building resident power, building youth leadership, and changing the narrative. And so I will quickly run through each of those, again, in the interest of time. So leveraging partnerships is really about creating those tables, those shared spaces where non-traditional folks come together and actually leverage their relationships. And so, it is about, supporting space and time for young people to sit at decision-making tables, with the superintendent, with the school board, with the county, public health. And so how we do that is really important, but it's about leveraging those partnerships and creating those types of spaces. We think that collaboration is key, very similar to what I was just describing around leveraging partnerships. We also know that, there are certain tenets around collaboration, and it's about, really coming up with a shared set of values before decisions are made. And so that's really where we think that, collaborative efficacy is key, just in terms of bringing folks to the table. Ultimately, we think that, both residents and young people, I think as my previous colleagues have said, those folks who have traditionally been left out of decision-making table, our Building Healthy Communities effort is really about bringing those folks to the table, building their leadership, building their capacity so that they're actually driving real change, and then also around the narrative piece. And so we think it's also really valuable to change the frame around how our communities, especially our communities of need, are perceived, right? And so, a lot of times our communities are essentially labeled as kind of red zones and places like that. And what we've heard pretty loud and clear from communities is we know it's tough. We know it's hard to live in these places. So don't just, perpetuate the negative frame, but start to talk about our communities as assets, and start to talk about, our children and our young people as, kind of the next generation of California leaders. And so that's where we've also really, introduced a communications element to really start to challenge some of those perceptions. And so as I'm looking at the clock, I certainly want to lift up a couple of our learnings here. And so if I can ask for the next slide, please, Rachel. We think there's a couple of areas that, we've learned a whole lot from. We do have in each of our 14 places, and it's tied to our evaluation and learning department, we have evaluation and learning specialists in each of our places. They're connected to the hubs. They're connected to both the local goals and the local, objectives that folks are trying to move, as well as connected to our organizational evaluation and learning efforts, which is really about creating the network and the space and time for folks to learn from one another, but it's also about keeping us on track. And so along those ways, that's where we're able to really support authentic community capacity. We're able to support, local decision-making and meet communities where they are. We know that Coachella is not in the same place as East Oakland. It's not in the same place as Boyle Heights, but it's important for us as well as we think of California's health. And so, a couple of the real wins that we've seen over the last couple of years is we're starting to see young people really, kind of reset the frame around school discipline. We're seeing more young people stay in school. We're seeing historically low, suspension and expulsion levels. We're starting to see, the reinvestment in the social and emotional supports of young people, both in schools and in their communities. And we're really starting to see, kind of momentum across the state, in terms of really prioritizing where the needs exist. So on that note, I think I'm going to go ahead and wrap up and answer any questions that may come my way.
Great. Thank you, Albert. I have just a quick follow-up. What's your feedback loop like with your grantees in the community as you get as maybe you're hitting a bad patch somewhere? How do you find that out? Is there a way to, beyond grant reports, how do you keep, a feedback loop going?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say that there's multiple ways in which we're surfacing feedback and seeking that type of feedback. So one, we have a cross-site learning system. Our cross-site learning system actually has an evaluation and learning specialist positioned in each of our 14 places that are tied to a network, which is really looking at our kind of cross-site measurements, our progress, both locally and across the state. So there's that method. We also convene a number of gatherings throughout the year. So not only in our evaluation and learning space, but in our Building Healthy Community space, where we bring, different work groups together. So we may just focus on a neighborhood issue. We may focus on a neighborhood and schools issues. But there are different spaces where we bring folks together. And then, of course, we have our annual grantee feedback survey, and so we have a range of methods by which we get feedback. And it would also be remiss of me to say that we also see, and it was important for me to talk about our staff being embedded in our communities, but we also see the partnership, and so there are moments where we've had to correct our strategy so that it's more responsive to community needs. We've had to slow things down at certain moments. So those are a number of ways in which we receive feedback.
Great, thank you. And now we have Marty Zanghi, who is the Director of Youth and Community Engagement at the Muskie School of Public Service at the University of Southern Maine. Welcome, Marty.
Thank you, Sherry and Stacy, Rich and Albert. I feel like the caboose taking the train into the station here. So again, I'm Marty Zanghi, and I direct the Youth and Community Engagement programs at the Muskie School of Public Service in Portland, Maine. And I've had the good fortune for the past 15 years to help run an amazing youth leadership program for youth in foster care called WILAT. That's the Youth Leadership Advisory Team. And with the brief time that I have, I'd like to spend it exploring our practice on how we support youth as change agents. And I believe that the model and the approach that we have utilized with this group of young adults is really transferable to other populations of youth, young adults, and parents. And I really liked what Rich said a few moments ago. First of all, I thought what everyone said was fabulous, and I wish we could have more of a dialogue. But I loved what Rich said a few moments ago about how important it is to pick the things that people care about. So as a result of my time, I hope you have a chance to have a stronger understanding as to why youth voice is important to social change efforts, such as the collective impact approach. So I want to discuss 5 things with you. 1, our guiding values. 2, the importance of infrastructure. 3, providing continuum of opportunities and activities for young adults to get involved in leadership activities. The importance of peer leadership and co-facilitation, and the commitment to relationships, trust, and results, putting all those pieces together. Let me talk about our values. First of all, our model is based on the belief that the best approach to youth engagement and youth leadership is to utilize a strategy that honors youth and adults working together in a partnership. It really is a relational approach. We have 5 core values, but because of time, I'll only be able to discuss a couple of those. But if you go to our website, you will actually find a publication on the WILAT model and its approach. First value is that each partner brings expertise. And for the youth, this is really quite interesting because they've had such rich life experiences and wisdom that only can be known from their direct personal experiences of growing up in foster care. The trauma and the experiences they have is quite unique. So their wisdom can be of great value to anyone coming in contact with them, whether they're from the child welfare system, judicial system, policymakers, or foundations themselves. It's really important to recognize that youth can never be discounted for being too young, too inexperienced, or too close to the issues, or too vulnerable. Obviously, we have to take into consideration their developmental and the safety issues around being appropriately involved and engaged. But we really have to think about youth leaders as emerging leaders, and that every social change effort should have those that are most impacted by the programs, the services, and the efforts that we're talking about involved in this process. So it's very important not to discount young people's voice in the process. The second value I want to talk about is that each partner exercises leadership. For youth, we really believe and practice that all youth have the capability to lead. We are a low-barrier youth leadership engagement program. Youth don't apply, they don't qualify. Just because they were actually part of the foster care system, they're welcome into this effort. And we have to model this by giving youth the inspiration, the skills, the confidence, and the support to lead. The important point here is to recognize that leadership takes many, many different forms, and it's our role to create those opportunities. It's not about going and finding the youth who are already in leadership positions, but to actually find youth who are never engaged or called upon to build those skills. It's, again, about the emerging leadership. For each partner exercising leadership, the adult piece is actually quite hard sometimes. It's about adults showing up and listening, being present, showing up fully, okay, not just sitting off on the sidelines. And it's about being inspired to move from the inspiration and the experience that they're having with the young person to actual action. So it's about taking the testimony, the experience that the youth provide, and moving it from inspiration to action. And you can do this through modeling certain behaviors, whether it's the supervision of workers, the training, the policies, the practices that are put into place. I've never met a leader who hasn't been inspired by what a young person's experiences are, or what they say, what they recommend, their policy comments. But I have met leaders who can't move from that inspiration to the action. So for adults, it's really about showing up and helping the group and their organizations move to action. The third value is each partner changes and grows through participation. I'm not going to go into that one today. Fourth is that each partner is included fully. And I've heard previous presenters talk about this piece. So for youth, because of the nature of the fact that the child welfare system is really very traditional and very controlling and incredibly unpredictable to youth, we strive to break those traditional barriers by being inclusive, by building team, by valuing different personality and learning styles and abilities. Therefore, we have to be fluid, adaptive, and non-traditional. So for the adults, again, it's about joining. It's about not staying on the sidelines, but sitting with and being part of the conversation, the process. And this is kind of interesting because I've been talking with some colleagues about this lately. I think in the field, we talk a lot about youth coming to the table or setting the table for them. But I actually think sometimes what we really have to do is hold little picnics with young people and actually go out and have the conversations with them where they are most comfortable. So it may not necessarily be about the superintendent having youth come to the school board meeting, but how does an adult leader get outside their comfort zone and go and actually have those community conversations with youth where it's most important. And then the last value is that each partner gives and receives respect. If you want more information, do go to our website. The next piece I want to talk about is infrastructure, and I can't overemphasize how important this is. Infrastructure, infrastructure, infrastructure. We are a statewide organization in the sense that we do statewide activities for young people, like conferences and trainings, but we also have 8 different district community sessions which meet with youth monthly on a regular basis. But when I talk about the infrastructure, I'm talking about the scaffolding to bring the work together and to sustain it over the long term. And in order for that infrastructure to occur, then the organization has to buy into the concept and to the values that youth have a role or adults have a role to identify the issues that need to be addressed. They have to be truly committed. The organizations have to be truly committed to implementing the values into their organization, into its culture, into its practice. And it may mean having to change the way they do business. And the reality is, our models to this point have not worked. So we really have to look at how we do change the way we do things. So how are staff trained, supported, supported and freed up to actually help train, support, guide, mentor, and problem solve for young people themselves. How are organizations and their cultures, and when I talk about organizations, I mean nonprofits, schools, foundations, funders, private sector, how are they changing their culture that supports youth to actually be in their workplace, to actually pay stipends to young people for their advice? How do they provide internships? How do we support them to get involved in policy decisions and debates, supporting them through to testify, to write testimony, to show up before legislature, for being on boards, not youth boards, but boards of directors, or be on hiring committees for staff, or reviews of teachers. So it's really about moving from inspiration to the action. Next slide, please. So the last few pieces I want to talk about is really providing a continuum of opportunities and activities for youth to be involved. And we do a variety of things, and again, like I said earlier, it's that everyone can be a leader. It's about providing the right skills, trainings, and opportunities. So youth participate in trainings. They're involved in speaking engagements. They do pre-service training for foster parents, for caseworkers, for the judicial system. They actually review, write policy. Many cases over the last 10, 15 years, we have actually had youth write state policy. When a state administrator says, I'm not sure about what our permanency policy should be, why don't we have the youth write it? It's about conference planning, conference presenting. If I was really doing this right, actually, I would have a youth be presenting this and not me. So it's about getting them involved in national and local events. It's ensuring that we do have low barrier opportunities and that everyone can contribute, and it's about finding the right fit and finding the opportunities for building the skills and for the training. The next piece is about the power of storytelling, and I know we've talked about this in the past, but we do a lot about training and supporting youth to come together around strategic sharing. And I think it's the Foster Care Alumni Association of America and perhaps Casey Family Programs that have developed some tools around strategic sharing. Everybody has a story, particularly young people who've been served by systems, but it's about how that story is best utilized to have the greatest impact and to cause the least amount of harm to that young person. Because many times I've seen storytelling that actually re-traumatizes a young person. The next piece is about getting them the opportunity to actually get involved in policy and legislative opportunities. Many folks actually think that youth don't understand what policy is. And I've had many young people have more of an understanding as to how the policy process works than some folks that are involved in the system itself. So providing them with the support, helping them craft their legislation, helping them practice their testimony. We actually have youth who every January go before the legislature and do an orientation for the new legislators on what it means to be a youth and child welfare system. And the next piece is actually getting involved in participatory research. And it's the opportunity to have youth trained as researchers, and we actually stipend youth here as work study students or as just stipend them, even if they're not students, to do environmental scans, to do mapping exercises. We actually have a statewide homeless count that's coming up here, and we are actually going to train homeless youth to get involved in doing the outreach and being involved in that count. So I think we have to recognize that it's about giving those opportunities and those skills to get them involved in the leadership and the engagement. And then the next piece is the peer leadership and co-facilitation. And I think it's really important, and this is a piece where I think we've just evolved over the last few years. But what we do is our YLAT alumni are matched with district YLAT meetings. Those are the monthly meetings that occur. And they serve as co-facilitators at these meetings. They are primarily focused on planning and preparing, co-facilitating the meetings, setting the agenda, helping recruit youth. And they, as the alumni co-facilitators, serve as role models for the present YLAT youth. It encourages positive relationships between the older youth and the younger youth, and it really promotes that concept of building trust, creating safety. I saw recently on a site visit to LifeLink in the Bronx, unbelievable youth leadership co-facilitation, where youth peers are actually the educators in their bridging programs. a really amazing model where co-leaders and co-facilitation, co-education is really emphasized. And my last point, and I know we're all about out of time, is I really always try to balance, and I learned this years ago through the Interaction Institute for Social Change out of Boston, the importance of balancing the time that you put into relationship building, trust, and we've heard this on this webinar already, the importance of building trust. Relationship and trust takes time. You have to value the process, but you also have to get to the results. And it's really about those young people and the community coming together to identify what those results are. And you have to do this with the honesty and the love that many of these young people have never experienced before. So you really have to value that process piece. So in closing, I really think it's important to adhere to a certain set of values, have that infrastructure, and to create those opportunities and activities for youth to participate. Thank you.
Great, Marty. Thank you so much for that. We're at the time now to start talking about some the questions and answers, and we've been getting a great deal of them. So one of the things I want to, there's been sort of a theme of them, and so I'll move around on those and try to get as many answers as possible. But one of the things I wanted to ask you, Marty, is what's your sort of strategy for sustaining the work? I mean, how do you keep this work going? How do you keep individuals engaged over time? Once your youth age out, do they still participate? Is it because you have sort of a cycle? How do you keep people engaged?
That's many questions in one. So I think for us, the issue of engagement is really not challenging at all because there are so many issues out there that need to be addressed. And it's really about having the proper convening skills, facilitation skills, group skills, being able to set the guiding principles and forming an agenda that is a collective agenda. So, you're never challenged with having young people show up. I think the challenge is to getting a cast of characters that come together and value each other as experts and are willing to look at issues, topics, and behave differently than perhaps they have in the past. And historically, it's not the challenge of getting the young people to show up. It really is the challenges of having adults showing up and behaving and adhering to principles that are different than what they are normally used to. The other piece that's really important, I emphasize, is the alumni, the graduates, the peer leadership is extremely important. The youth of today, the younger youth are far more likely to be engaged if they can see one of their peers who has overcome the kind of adversity. So I'll pause there.
Great. Excuse me. Thank you. Now I'd like to open up the questions and get everyone involved in the conversation. A question's come up about sort of what are the specific strategies that organizations have used to engage residents? For example, can you sort of think about how to initiate the engagement, how to identify the right leaders in a place? Stacy?
Sure. Well, for us it varies. I mean, I think one of the things that we try to do is, and I know what a lot of United Ways will do is, there are already traditional linkages with organizations and institutions. In many cases, we'll try to leverage the networks that they have in place to make the connection between us and the community and ensure that if we're inviting people into a conversation, maybe they're doing it with another trusted organization that they already are familiar with. If it's within a workplace, we may be starting with asking the folks with whom we have the closest relationships in the workplace to sort of host those for us. In other words, we recognize that in many cases we may not be the trusted entity, we may not be the known entity that people feel comfortable engaging with or accepting an invitation for engagement, but if we're working with other organizations that people are familiar with, that seems to be a good starting point for us. And so we can deepen the relationships across the community. And for us, it's about getting as broad across the community as possible so that everyday people have a chance to be heard.
Great, thank you. So one of the questions we've asked is there, can you address sort of the 5 elements of collective impact as a new model for bringing about community change, and how you've actually engaged ordinary citizens as a group in one or more of implementing sort of the elements of collective impact?
You want me to take that, Sherry?
Sure. You can start, and then we'll move around.
Okay. Well, I mean, some of the examples that I mentioned earlier in San Diego and Spokane, in many cases, those United Ways wouldn't even be positioned to be seen by the community as the appropriate backbone for that work had that community engagement not come early on. In fact, and I'll use Spokane as an example, our Spokane United Way really wanted to be more deeply engaged in education, but wasn't seen as credible in that area as they wanted to be. And it wasn't until they began to do that community engagement in really authentic ways that the community began to see them differently, and even leaders began to see that United Way differently, because the United Way actually had real input from the community that was really valuable in how even leaders in the community understood that they needed to move forward. And so we almost see the leadership and collective impact as being built on the space of strong, authentic community impact, and then that engagement, has to really be sustained throughout the effort in order for that backbone to really be effective and be trusted in the community over time.
Great. Marty, do you want to talk about that? I'm sorry. My computer just went completely blank, so I lost the thing, and I apologize for that. So, Stacy, that was great. Thank you. Marty, did you have anything you wanted to add about how you're engaging in the 5 elements?
I think it's important that when it comes to young adults, and again, when we're talking about opportunity youth, we're talking 16 to 24-year-olds, and we're looking at the fact that they're going to have different kinds of mental stages and skill sets. So it may not necessarily be about always showing up in a setting that are traditional adult settings, whether it's meeting settings or board meetings. So, like, for example, if we're going to set a common agenda, it may mean that we're actually going out and having conversations with youth that are at the homeless provider, to sit down and have the community conversation there to find out what the pressing issues are, what the gaps are for services, what the issues are that they're facing on a regular basis. So it's really about taking non-traditional approaches. Like the shared measure piece, you'd be surprised that young people actually want to get involved in data conversations. The key here is that I think we have to throw away our lens about what we believe to be our traditional leaders. Recognize that a young person who might not be available because they've been pushed out from an educational system or they are homeless, they can still be given the opportunity to have input into any kind of collective impact activity. It's really about us trying to do things differently.
Great.
Sherry, can I just jump in on that real quick?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Hey, it's Rich. Just to build on what Stacy and Marty said, I've got an article actually coming out that Collective Impact Forum is publishing, hopefully in the next month or so, called Putting Community and Collective Impact. And I think one of the things that we should be thinking about is, yes, how do we implement those 5 pillars in a way that engages the community? But I think we need to even broaden our horizons a little bit more and think about what specific culture that we need to help create in communities that creates the right environment where this work can actually take place. So, for instance, the first pillar on building a common agenda, I think in terms of engaging communities, we need to think about not just building a common agenda, but how do we create genuine community ownership so that the community at large has a larger stake in this, that we're aligning our efforts to that community agenda in a way that really reflects what matters to us and what the community wants to work on together. And so in this paper, I lay out five different areas of civic culture we need to think about, much of which, or almost all of which, we've already talked about across the 4 speakers. But I think it's important to think about how it is that we actually develop the civic culture in our communities that can help us do this work, accelerate it, and importantly, sustain it over time as well.
Great. Albert, I want to give you a chance if you had anything you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, my colleagues have covered it quite nicely. The only other thing I would add is, we have to meet the communities where they are. And so, two examples that really bubble up for me, here in Fresno, about a year and a half ago or so, the community prioritized, the general plan. And really with the idea that it focuses on the urban core, because in the past, the general plan just kind of really supported, growth outwards. And so it was this coming together of, and Stacy reminded me of it, 3 community-based organizations, one that served the Southeast Asian community, one that served the Latino community, one that served the African American community. And it's not so much that, those 3 organizations came together in a kind of tokenistic way, but they came together to better understand each other in the community, how their communities could come together in terms of shared priorities around, what was important in their community. And so it was this beautiful space in terms of seeing, language being, simultaneously translated into 3 different languages. I think it gets to the core of one, kind of respecting where communities are at, creating transparency, but also building trust and going slow. I think that was a 2 or 3 year process, in terms of just a couple weeks ago, the city of Fresno, for the first time ever, prioritizing, an effort that is really about revitalizing the core of our city. But it really kind of gets to that level of trust building between, a funder like the California Endowment and community-based organizations to meet, where the communities are at, to get to that authentic level of engagement. So that's the only thing I would add, Sherry.
Great, thanks. Let's talk a little bit about sustainability. You mentioned, a couple of you mentioned the company. This is a long process. So what are the time frames for the efforts? Do you have an exit strategy when you start, or do you have sort of a timeline in mind when you go into these efforts to engage the community? Why don't we start with Stacy again? Sorry.
Sure. I think. Because we see ourselves as so fundamentally tied in terms of our value proposition around collective impact, I think we think of this as a really essential part of our business model. We went through a process a few years ago, and we've kind of continued it throughout, of helping United Way's really understand how to transition from that more traditional community fundraiser role to really being this sort of backbone to community change, and really built into and codified for our business model that this kind of authentic community engagement and listening is sort of fundamental to how we operate. For us, we measure success in a number of different ways. We measure it in terms of the impact we make in communities. We measure it in terms of the resources we're able to garner to apply to that strategic change, and we measure it by trust. And that public trust is really built off of the authenticity of how we are positioned in communities. And there's just no exit strategy or separating out or time frame that gets attached to that. It's just an enduring part of who we are and who we have to be in order to succeed. So I don't know if that helps, but.
Great. Albert, as a funder, thank you, Stacey, for that. But Albert, as a funder, do you go into this with a particular time frame for the efforts? Do you go in there with an exit strategy? How do you approach this?
Thanks, Sherry. So when we, launched our Building Healthy Communities effort, we attached a 10-year time frame to that. So our start was 2010. We think our sunset is slated to be 2020, and we're currently, both in conversations internally around what does that mean and what is the, kind of next strategic direction for TCE, but also talking with our communities about what that means, what the implications are. So it's an ongoing conversation. it's a complex conversation. And so, I think that, over the next couple of years that will continue to take shape. But, one of the tenets that went into our Building Healthy Communities effort was, and we had no preconceived notion that we were going to completely transform these communities from, places of challenges to thriving communities. But we thought that we would begin to set the communities on a trajectory, again, kind of acknowledging that our effort is grounded in the systems and policy change work. So we think that as our communities are building, healthier communities, those changes will continue to support community change and community health, long after our BHC initiative is gone, including our support for our youth leadership, because we think that that's also, as Marty is talking about, it's also really helping to build the leadership capacity for the cohort of leaders who will stay in communities long after TCE is gone.
This is Marty, and I know this is an oversimplification, but the reality is as long as there are community problems and issues that need to be addressed, there's going to be a need for community engagement. So the sustainability really is about how we continue to engage populations, parents, young people, community members who aren't normally engaged in some of these kind of dialogue and discourse. So from a sustainability perspective, it's about how we continue to provide the right platforms, the safe places for people to show up and share. So it is a long-term process, because let's face it, the issues facing this country today are as significant as they have been in the past.
Great. Another question I have is, how have you gone from sort of moving grass tops organizations from a what do I need to do for community to the mindset of what and how should I be working with the community and its leaders as equal partners in owning a collective agenda and goals for the overall health of the community? Rich, you want to get some insight on that based on what you've been seeing?
Sure. I mean, I think for us, it's first of all, changing the frame of the conversation from one of problems to people's shared aspirations for the community, and what are the conditions that we need to create in order for us to move toward those aspirations. As people start to have that conversation, what we find is they make, as someone said in one of the questions that I saw, they begin to make a mindset shift, which I think, an orientation shift, which I think is really pivotal here, from being inward-looking, that my organization has to solve all the problems, or my organization has all the solutions, or I'm the single leader who's going to be heroic in the community, to understanding that the only way in which we can begin to move towards these shared aspirations and a common agenda is by us working together. And so when people make that turn outward, they begin to see that they need other assets to work with, that they need other groups to partner with, that they need other leaders to partner with, that the community itself needs to be part of the solution. And I think that becomes, but as my colleagues have said, developing that kind of reorientation and that kind of sense of ownership over where the community wants to go is a process. It's not simply about holding some conversations and writing a report. It's how we engage people in what we've learned from those conversations. It's changing the frame of the conversations, as I said before. It's beginning to understand that we're not going to be able to get everyone on board walking in lockstep to achieve these goals, but that we've got to figure out who we can run with now so that we can begin to create a trajectory for moving forward. And what we find in communities is, as that begins to happen, other groups start to realize in a pretty kind of pragmatic way, either I'm going to change the way I do business in this community, or I'm going to be left by the wayside. And if I'm well left by the wayside, I will endanger my own relevance and significance in the life of this community.
Thanks, Rich. Well, a specific relation to that is, are there specific strategies for thinking about how you move to that conversation? Because I think what a lot of grass tops leaders would say and community groups would think is sort of, this is such a long-term process, and if it's not your full-time job, how do you keep people engaged and motivated in this kind of thing over a long period of time, sort of specific ways to keep that going and keeping people engaged, so it's not just sort of like so I feel like as a grass top or as a sort of the community organization that I'm sort of the one who's in this day to day, and we have people coming in and out, and how do I keep it going and keeping to realize it's a partnership and keeping that engagement. I'm going to actually, anybody who wants to jump in can jump in on that one.
I'll jump in. This is Stacy. I think one of the things that I'll pull from our example of United Way in Milwaukee, because I think one of the things that they did is they did a lot of engaging on the issue of reducing teen pregnancy in Milwaukee a few years ago, set a really ambitious goal to reduce teen pregnancy by 45% in 10 years. They reached that goal about 3 years early, and have still been seeing declines. Tremendous progress on that issue, which for Milwaukee was one of the had the highest rates of teen pregnancy of anywhere in the country. And I think one of the things that our United Way did really effectively there was they obviously did a ton of engagement with young people throughout Milwaukee, parents, teachers, and a lot of folks that were touching the lives, either the lives of young people or folks touching the lives of young people directly. But in terms of some of the institutional players, one of the things that they did to keep their interest and really help them understand the importance of being a part of a collective was they made sure that the initiative, they listened to what was really important to those institutional players and made sure that the initiative and the focus was that perspective was taken into account, and made sure that the initiative was presented as something that would help them achieve those goals. So just an example, the companies, it's very hard to get companies, big for-profit institutions to tackle and take on the issue of teen pregnancy. For a lot of companies, it's just not an issue that they want to necessarily take on. You don't really see that in their CSR portfolio necessarily. But healthcare costs for those companies were extremely high, and a lot of that was driven by the high public health costs that were also being driven by the high teen pregnancy rates. And so they appealed to the companies they were working with to say, look, if you really want to deal with and address your own healthcare costs, then it behooves you and it's in your interest to be involved in this collective effort that we've got going on, where they understood that they alone couldn't solve it, nor could the United Way, but they understood that if we're going to get at this, we've got to touch a variety of different lives and sectors across the community to make progress. And they were willing, with some definitive plans, some clear outcomes that United Way and the community said it wanted to try to achieve, they were able to communicate that in clear terms that business people understood. So that's just one example of, kind of reaching people where they are, and everyone doesn't understand the issues or relate to the issues or communicate the issues in the same way. But if you can figure out how to listen and then put that back in language that people understand, it can resonate more clearly for them.
Great. Thank you, Stacy. We are running out of time, and I want to be respectful of people's time, but I have one final question, and then I'll give my closing remarks. So this question keeps coming up, sort of sustaining the work, not just sort of with people's effort, but how do you sustain this work funding-wise? Is there how do you keep people engaged, keep funders engaged? I think Albert obviously is a funder. I'm going to give you the last word on this. I think, do you see a transition in how funders are thinking about this kind of work into a long-term sort of sustainable process? As you think about your exit strategy, you're thinking about your grantees, helping them figure out their sustainability strategy and getting money in the door in a different way, as well as that part of your exit strategy?
Yeah, Sherry, this is Albert. I think it's Marty was right. I mean, we're going to have ongoing, kind of community challenges, I think, as long as we have communities. I do think that there has to be, a shelf life, a beginning, a middle, and an end of a particular campaign and initiative. That doesn't mean that there aren't new beginnings. But I think it's important, that we bake that into our kind of framework moving forward. And so, I know that, as I said earlier, when we think about sustainability, we think about the sustainability of our BHC work and our partners on the ground. We know that there's going to be ongoing needs. And so at least with this particular initiative, that's really, I think, the shelf life that we're thinking of around this particular portion. The other side of the equation, at least for the California Endowment, is that we are a funder. We will continue to have a need to support community work and community organizations in perpetuity. And so while we might, kind of make some shifts and changes in the short term, we'll continue to, partner with our communities, especially here in California, around community change.
Great, thank you. I want to thank all of you for joining us today for It's About the Community, Why Community Engagement and Process Matter and Collective Impact. We hope you enjoyed the presentations, and I want to give a special thank you to our panelists today, Stacey Stewart, Rich Harwood, Albert Maldonado, and Marty Zanghi. Rich had stolen my thunder on that, but I was going to mention that we have a forthcoming publication, the Collective Impact Forum with Harwood Institute, on putting the community engagement and collective impact. Be on the lookout for that soon on collectiveimpactforum.org. If you want to continue the conversation on collective impact, we invite you to visit the Collective Impact Forum website, which is the URL I just gave, www.collectiveimpactforum.org, where you can find information on other webinars and in-person training opportunities, and the slides for this will also be there. As a reminder, we ask you to take a moment to complete the evaluation that will appear momentarily on your screen. Your comments and suggestions are important to us as they help us provide with future quality programming. Thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to continuing the conversation.